Good morning to everybody. Welcome to today's breakout session. My name is Shane Pereira and I'll be your moderator today. And joining me will be Mr. Krish Raval and Mr. Tim Dixon. And in keeping, yes, please. And in keeping with the spirit of the other breakout rooms, we would like to keep this conversational. There will be people who will have mics during the Q&A session. Please feel free to raise your hands and ask questions. In the last few days at the conference, we've looked at how cohesion and how initiatives and interactions in the common space can help foster social cohesion. We also looked at some of the challenges of these spaces, including in the online space. Now, in Singapore, there are a variety of legislative tools, such as the Maintenance of Religious Harmony Act, that help with these challenges. The government also works with religious leaders closely to maintain the fabric of religious harmony, as well as grassroots initiatives such as the interreligious harmony circles to foster social cohesion between different religious groups. For this session, we thought we'd look at how initiatives and strategies in the common space may dovetail or complement even provide new avenues for the protection and enhancement of social cohesion. And one of the threats to social cohesion is the possibility that vulnerable groups and individuals, such as the disenfranchised, may experience weakened solidarity in the sense of belonging. And this may put them at risk of some form of extreme views or radicalization. In my own experience as a policy researcher in the Institute of Policy Studies, we help contribute to this idea of social cohesion by looking at the disenfranchised, looking at poverty, and looking at ways in which the marginalized can be more integrated and cohesive within our society. For this session, we would like to look at strategies and on-the-ground initiatives from the experiences of our two speakers. And we would like to start with Mr. Tim Dixon. Thank you very much. To share some of his experiences on the ground and the years of championing to bridge social and economic divisions and the threat of extremism.
Thank you very much, Shane. And it's great to share in the hospitality and to learn so much from colleagues and new friends over the last couple of days. I want to jump in and start with a story. And in fact, what I want to do in the next 10 minutes is just talk about solutions to quite specific problems. So let me start with a very specific problem. From a town in Freital in Saxony in Germany. More in Common is an organization that has teams in Germany, also in France, in the US, in the UK, Poland, so 5 of the big Western democracies. And we work on cohesion and countering the power of these forces that are driving people apart in societies. The town of Freital, and I say it's a town, but in some ways it's not quite. It's 7 villages that 100 years ago were sort of jammed together. It's never had a very strong sense of civic identity. It's in Saxony, Eastern Germany, so the former Eastern Germany, and therefore it's sort of somewhat left behind. There's not a lot of prosperity there. And in the big migrant intake of 2015, 2016, many people came to that town as they were spread out all over across Germany. And there were real problems within the community there with these new arrivals. So the problem was, how do you deal with the rise of hatred, resistance? In fact, there was a neo-Nazi group that was making death threats against people in the community. It's quite a serious escalation of risk in that community. There was an initiative of a bunch of community organisations to counter that risk, the threat of violence, and to promote diversity and promote welcome. But the problem was that a lot of the groups they needed to engage didn't see themselves as part of that diversity coalition. How is it relevant for them? They said basically it's not for us. Now, we were brought in to assist with a coalition of community organisations who are active there. And one of the key insights that comes out of social psychology, behavioural science, is that if you want to break down the us versus them divisions, you don't elevate a them, you tell a story of a larger us. So what we worked with them on was how to promote civic pride and civic identity in Freitag, which really hadn't been done in the past 100 years. And we did very practical things like creating a community calendar that was distributed across the town. And the calendar had the faces of people of Freitag from all walks of life, including some of the faces of newly arrived migrants. But it was telling a story of them as part of this larger story of us. There was a sudden aha moment in one meeting when one of the leaders of the groups that had been opposed and said they didn't want to take part stood up and said, you know, I've been watching all of this and I've suddenly realised that the diversity includes us. Diversity is not just about them, it includes us too. And we want to be part of this because we want to promote Freitag, we want a better future for our town. It was just that little tweak in approach of uplifting all rather than uplifting one group, albeit a marginalised group, but uplifting all that brought this larger effort together. And that's an example, something that we see in many places where the larger us story is a way of bringing a lot more people to the table rather than just the usual suspects of people who are already committed, already involved. So let me share some insights from our work and just what sits behind a kind of an evidence-based approach to solving these problems of division. This is More in Common. We published a whole bunch of reports. Moreincommon.com shows them. The first thing that I want to highlight in terms of very practical solutions is having good evidence to identify the people most at risk in community. Now, I'll share these slides, and if anybody wants a full copy of them, hopefully we can upload them on the website. So I'm not going to go through this in detail, but I just want to show a little bit of what we do. We've done this in the UK, France, Germany, US, and it's a mapping of people according to behavioural science, basically people's identity and values. It incorporates a whole bunch of different indicators that the science indicate affect people's orientation towards society. What it does is, it's mapping here, essentially it's kind of people from a spectrum of being more open to more closed, more open to change, to people who are different from them to more closed, but that's an oversimplification, there's a lot more to it. There's kind of more than one axis, basically. Some of it's about your level of trust, your level of engagement. There's a whole bunch of different, five areas of social psychology that go into this mapping. But what's significant is that when you map it this way, you identify 2 or 3 groups typically who are more at risk, they're lower trust, less engaged, more at risk of buying into us versus them because they're more fearful, they have a lower sense of belonging and so forth. And critically, the people who most often turn up for the kind of activities that we often create when we're involved in the sector, when we're working on social cohesion, they're typically actually only from 1 or 2 of those groups. And one of the risks of our activities, therefore, is that they don't reach the people we need to. And so this gives us a way of measuring who are the people we need to reach, and then when we're doing activities, are we reaching those people? So, for example, here in France, there's 3 low trust groups. Forgotten France represents 2 of them. In Germany, it's a similar model. We call them the invisibles. Again, there's 3 groups there. And in the United States, the groups in the middle there, particularly the passive liberals and politically disengaged, have lower levels of trust. Again, I can go into those in more detail if it's useful later, but I just wanted to flag that turns into something very practical on the ground, that having that typology that allows people to understand each other within society in ways that aren't just the demographics, aren't just the religious group, colour of skin, or their politics, but actually give a different lens, helps people to navigate change, to lead through periods of polarisation. Just in the last few days, I had somebody from one of our partner groups in the United States say, this has been super helpful for our school boards, where a lot of division is showing up in communities across the United States, and just being able to understand and empathise with people with their different backgrounds through that typology. So that's another solution to problem. Third problem is perception gaps. This is the problem that the people who have strong political identities, it's about 1 in 3 people in most of the societies where we work, they tend to have the most inaccurate and exaggerated views of people on the other side of any division. So, for example, both Democrats and Republicans tend to imagine the number of extremists on the other side are about 2 to 3 times the number that there really is. And this is a mapping here. You can see the perception gap, that is the gap between reality and truth, is strongest on the wing groups, the groups with the strongest political identities. Why is that important? Because if we understand that part of the problem is that we just don't understand each other, then we can work with partners to address that. For example, we have media partnerships where media organizations have realized, actually from our data, the more you consume every form of media in the United States other than local television, the more inaccurate your view of the other side of politics is. And you know, also education, the more educated you are, the most inaccurate American in their understanding of the other side, their opponents, is an American with a PhD. The most accurate, the person who's the best understanding, is a black American who hasn't finished high school. So some of our information systems, not just the disinformation we talk about in Twitter, but just mainstream media, are sometimes feeding the misunderstanding of each other. I mentioned the diversity example, just two more things to mention for you as solutions to problems. StoryCorps is a great organization in the United States that has chronicled the stories of about 800,000 Americans. They sit down for a conversation, 40 minutes, it's recorded, the recording goes to the Library of Congress, and it's been people who've known each other, loved ones, friends, family, and it's beautiful stuff. When I was a Prime Minister's speechwriter, Prime Minister's advisor for some years in Australia, I used to have to commute from Sydney to Canberra all the time, 3-hour drive, and it was just wonderful listening to this. They have like podcasts and they're on NPR radio in the US a lot. And it was like a balm of being reminded that humans are all right, you know, humans are decent. I worked with animals all the time because I worked in the political arena. And I'd listen to these and it's just something incredibly powerful about the authentic voices of ordinary people. What one small step, a new initiative StoryCorps is doing, is bringing those voices into the polarized debates in America. Because we know that, in fact, Americans have very low trust in politicians, very low trust in business leaders, very low trust in civic leaders, community organizations, the national organizations, but they trust people who they see as just like them. So ordinary, authentic, real voices who they feel they can relate to, showing that people from different sides of an argument, different sides of issues, can have a conversation, can find common ground, is really powerful. And we've just started testing as a partner with One Small Step, the StoryCorps, and it's incredible to see. We get like responses of 8 or 9 out of 10 Americans listening to that say this makes them feel more confident about the country's ability to navigate the divisions. And you know, that's the big problem right now in the US, is a complete loss of confidence that the country can manage difference and manage division. And that's something that we see in conflict societies across the world. So just finding practical ways like this, and the whole point of this is not that you get millions of people to do it, it's that you create media content that you get onto lots of different platforms, which is interesting, engaging, which people can consume and can shift their perceptions of each other and restore social trust. And the last thing just to mention really quickly is there's an exciting development coming from one of our partner organizations, Over Zero, and it's to help with the problem that we have across the world. There's been a fair bit of conversation about belonging over the last couple of days here, but we're actually very fuzzy in the way that we measure what belonging is and how people experience it. We know that if people have a strong sense of belonging, it builds a really strong resilience against division, but we don't have good ways of measuring. So this is an initiative Over Zero has been working on over the last year. They're about to launch in the next couple of weeks. And it's a starting point for giving us a tool where we can measure, like in an intervention, we can measure between countries, like the radar that's just been launched in the last couple of days here for Southeast Asia. It gives us a better capacity to understand people's sense of belonging and therefore to develop initiatives that work and can have impact. So that's a quick tour through 5 problems, 5 solutions. There's lots of them. We're part of a larger ecosystem that is building solutions to what I feel is really, the defining problem across the democratic world of the 2020s. And what's especially exciting about being here for this conversation is I think this is Singapore's moment. I think Singapore, for the very unique historic reasons, has been thinking about these issues in a much more sophisticated way and acting on them for half a century. And I think the world's going to be beating a path to the door of this country over coming years to learn from what Singapore's practiced. And I think this event is a great way to start that process. Thanks.
Thank you, Tim. I thought that was really, really insightful. And what struck me first is also basically the typology that you presented, right? And because the first question is always, who are the vulnerable? Who are the people we're trying to help? who are we trying to integrate. And it seems to me also that this is where the strength of community-level initiatives versus, say, the broader whole-of-government policy approach works, marvels. But with that respect, then, perhaps we can hear from Mr. Krish Raval, especially in terms of how leadership helps in this whole initiative.
Thank you. Well, I'll remain here if I may. And can I firstly thank the incredible organizers for the hospitality that they've shown. The Young People's Program, which is what I have been involved with, is just amazing. And I want to thank the young leaders in their absence. And then just recognize the many friends in the audience who have been involved in the work that I have been doing. There's Julie Siddiqui at the back, there's Lord Alderdice I see at the front, and the other faculty and friends who are in the room. So if I may, I'll talk to you about an example of an organization that brings diversity and turns it into cohesion. And these are two distinct concepts as far as I'm concerned. I think Tim's typology shows that, we are diverse anyway. We're diverse whether we like it or not. Diverse according to different perspectives, typologies, diverse according to preferences, diverse according to cultures, diverse according to race. But it doesn't mean that we're healthily diverse. It doesn't mean that we understand each other. So the first concept is diversity in and of itself is not necessarily a healthy thing. It's not necessarily doesn't necessarily create cohesion. You can have silos that then have, that are historical and that are suspicious of other silos, and mistrust can breed in a purely diverse situation. That is, unless you have events like this or organizations that actually bridge the different silos. And the work we do, put very simply, is we identify lay and clerical leaders of faith and bring them together on a course to teach them two things. One, how to better lead their own organizations. And secondly, how to do it in a situation of plurality, in pluralism. So rather than talk to you endlessly about that program, I thought I'd show you a 2-minute video. Now this video, can I just tell you, is a video of shameless propaganda, so all you critics will see this. But it'll still give you a flavor of what we do. And then I'll tell you some stories, and then the most compelling part of this for us will be the interaction with you. Is that okay? So can I ask for the video?
In the 21st century, leaders are naturally bringing their faith to the table.
Leaders have to deal with complex challenges, not just within their community, but with those outside of their own community.
How do you broach these subjects? How do you raise these issues? How do you navigate all that?
Faith in leadership, it is one of the most needed movements that could exist today.
Faith in Leadership has created a revolutionary program.
Disagreeing agreeably is at the heart of Faith in Leadership.
They're speaking from the heart, their agenda is pure, and a generation of leaders are coming together, truly understanding one another.
If there is friendship among different faith leaders, that friendship can save peace, save lives. So I welcome it very much.
Krish has built a network of leadership across faith communities,
utilizing his remarkable ability to build trust and connect people.
Faith leadership is the resource for humanizing and reconciling the world we live in.
Different communities are looking out for leaders.
How those communities are led is vital to the future of our world.
To leave something valuable and meaningful for their next generation.
It will enrich lives. It will save lives.
I am transformed by my experience with other faith leaders.
And these are deep, authentic, meaningful relationships, but these are only the start.
To engage with one another, learn from each other.
To have confidence in our leadership.
And seeing things in a different perspective.
If I may say so, I do commend Faith in Leadership as an essential effort to realize the extraordinary human potential of our faith traditions to heal the world we share.
Thank you. So I hope you saw from there a number of things. One, the emphasis on hospitality, that what we do is take any opportunity to invite different people to live together, eat together, break bread together, argue well together. And sometimes we do it in really secure places where there are soldiers encircling them so that people can't escape. And those discussions and those interactions have led to all sorts of things that have really provided a substrate that have kept, I think, our country together, because it doesn't just happen automatically. And this is the thing, that when people who do the important work in CVE, countering violent extremism, say, well, are you dealing with would-be terrorists or would-be radicals? I say maybe, but maybe not. But that is a short-term approach. What we are into is the long-term building of coalitions and relations that to undergird the security and safety and cohesion that so many of us take for granted. One story then, as a result of this approach, is one where an imam who became very important in our country and advised governments and others, in the aftermath of a summer we had of just one extremely violent incident after another, decided to get all his brother imams together and hold hands across Westminster Bridge, where you see the iconic picture of London with the House of Commons. There's a bridge there. And all these imams held hands together, and they were sitting ducks. But they did this in solidarity with the victims and with the outrage that was in the country that could have led to all sorts of violent protests, and diffused that. And then he followed it up by issuing, and this is, he's the head of the Mosques Advisory Council and a major regulatory body, a representative body for the majority of imams in our country. He and his brother imams issued a fatwa that said that anyone accused of, anyone convicted of a terrorist incident would not be, their funeral would not be officiated over by any of the imams of that body. And similar things like that. I see people who are hugely influential in different realms, and I see my friend Julie Siddiqui at the back, a Muslim activist and leader. And I'll never forget when a very important Jewish spokesperson and woman leader, in a setting like this, full of official people and important people, stood and said, "I don't need to say anything else. I love you, Julie," she said, and just sat down, and that was the speech. And those kinds of relationships of trust lead to, between leaders, lead to followers actually building bridges. The third thing I'd like to say is that we really promote an engagement with media. So every week, our alumni, and we've intensively trained about 300 or 400, between 300 and 400 faith leaders, senior faith leaders across the country. But more than 3,000 younger leaders who are everywhere across the country. And we equip them to go on the media. So every week in the United Kingdom, we have 10 million people talking to an audience of 10 million people through Pause for Thought, which is the radio program, or various TV appearances. And what they're doing is, in their diverse ways, they are telling a shared story. That number one, we should disagree well. Number two, so we're different. But two, we live together and we need to work together and actually love one another well. And I see my time is up. Thank you.
Thank you, Krish. Yeah, I just want to say it ties in very nicely with what you and Tim have shared. In terms of, I was thinking back to plenary 1, where there was where we mentioned basically that solidarity and cohesion also comes from understanding oneself, right? Coming from the inside as well. So focus inward before focusing out. I think it ties in quite nicely because, as Tim mentioned, understanding diversity also includes us, right? And it's a kind of all of us together and trying to promote this. With that in mind, I wanted to ask basically, how what are some of the challenges actually that you faced in leadership, help, and in the community initiatives as well, where you found perhaps there were some conflicts or friction between leaders or even between members of the community, and how did you resolve those? Like to start, Tim?
I think one of the practical challenges, let me think of two. So one is that the people who turn up for bridge building activities are often not very connected to the people who they most need to reach. And so we do, because we've got this segmentation and a number of different websites in our national teams where you can go and you can answer questions in 10 minutes and it gives you a sort of 90% accurate story of like which tribe, which group you fit into. And we go to organisations who see themselves as very diverse because they look at their faces and their ages and their genders and they say, we're a very diverse organisation. And then when they do the quiz, they belong to one or two segments representing a maximum of 20%, 25% of the country. That's over and over again, I find that. And it's not a criticism of the organisation, it's just like you have to realise where you fit into society. And it's a real moment when the penny drops, because a lot of us who do this work carry a set of assumptions that are not shared by most people in our society. I mean, just a very practical example, we asked this question in Germany. So, you know, in Europe, the split around, it's kind of less a Christian-Muslim split, it's more just a fear of Muslims, a sort of uncertainty in many European countries. So we asked the question, do you agree or disagree with the statement, you know, Muslims are people like us? And the Cosmopolitan group, which is about 15-20% of the population, agreed with that, 70-something% agreed. But for the rest of the population, there wasn't any group where more than 10% agreed. So that helps to identify what the problem is. Now, it doesn't mean that they're hostile, but they're starting with a view that Muslims are different from me. And the challenge that you have is actually to bridge that. You don't need, like, that's the thing that ultimately, if you think people are different from you and then you get fearful, you feel under attack, then you'll buy into an us versus them story. So the problem is that we're starting often with people who have to reassess their own assumptions, and that can sometimes be a challenge. I think that's one part. The second thing to mention is, particularly in the US context, in the, you know, what crudely is talked about as kind of woke culture, people who are deeply concerned about inequities, but what they're doing unintentionally is, if I can use the term reifying, like making a thing out of difference because they want to correct historic marginalization. But what the social psychology tells us, that with the best efforts, you can reinforce the perception of difference, which is the heart of the problem. You need to start with commonality. So when that turns into a practical strategy, what is the commonality that one American has with another? Well, as a starting point, it's being American. Right? It's being American, it may be being a parent, whatever it is. But progressives, liberals in America, are very uncomfortable with American identity because they want to say, well, you know, we have this terrible history of oppression of minorities. They don't want to promote a sense of pride because they feel ill at ease with patriotism. And yet the patriotism is what really the majority of the population feels. So we ask the question, how do you feel when you see the American flag? Progressives will say, oh, very uncomfortable. Everybody else in the population essentially says, oh, pretty good. It's unifying. So it sort of comes down to the challenge is the folks who are often turning up to be part of change in a positive way sometimes need to start with their own assumptions, and those aren't easy conversations.
Yeah, so I would absolutely go along with that. I would say, firstly, and this is based on our work not only in the United Kingdom, but in India, in Northern Ireland, and to an extent in the United States. But in the United States, we work with what we call, or what your typology, or somebody with a similar typology calls confidently cosmopolitan. The people are very happy to be in environments like this. And on our programs, it's very easy to get people like that. And in the United States, there are loads and loads of people like that. It's really hard to get people who are deeply disenfranchised, which is another group of people. The people who feel in the United Kingdom really upset when their icons, like Winston Churchill, is referred to as a racist, or they see the change in their cities as somehow alarming and threatening. How do you get people like that onto the program? What do you do? And of course, when you have one or two people who are like that on the program, it does lead to trust. And that's why you need to work with, it's not just about people coming on a course or a conference. You have to do so much field work to gain confidence of people to come on the program. So that's number one. Number two, the challenge is to not get the ambitious people only on the program. So if you have a program that is associated with a royal family in the United Kingdom or important people, you can get lots and lots of people applying for the wrong reasons. And funders, for you funders out there, one of the metrics that they will measure is how many applications did you have on the program, on the assumption that the more people who apply to your program, the better it is. In fact, in situations where we have had, the one time we had hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of applications for like 30 places, we caused resentment, so for the first by refusing the majority of people who applied. And if the rule is first do no harm, you are actually creating enmity and further hostility by not giving people a place on the program. And on social media, then people start saying bad things about you. So the loss of anonymity that entails is also a challenge. But ultimately, I am inspired by the people of courage from our faiths who are bucking the trend and coming together to say, okay, we're going to stand shoulder to shoulder in good times and bad.
Thanks, Krish. I'm going to evoke my right as a moderator and ask one more question before I open to the floor. In that respect, then, I think one of the questions that especially we in Singapore like to ask is, how far should government help? Or what should government do more? Or should they do more? And I'm wondering, what do you see the role of government in terms of public policy in helping or shaping these initiatives that you're involved with?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is partly conditioned by kind of national conditions and cultural conditions. So the starting point of what the role that government plays in a country like Singapore is just different to the United States, for example. I was just talking to one of my German colleagues last night, actually. I was reflecting on the Singapore conversation, saying, I think there's parallels between Singapore and Germany, where countries with higher levels of trust in government and higher expectations of government delivering certain things and doing certain things, whereas that's less the case in other countries. The solution is not, and I'll say nothing more about Singapore because I'm not an authority and I think there's so much I have to learn. But let me talk more about Western countries. The solution in Western countries is not a Department of Social Cohesion, right? It's not siloizing this as like a thing that's different from everything else. Because the issue we're dealing with is that the centrifugal forces that have become more and more powerful in the last few years in our societies. They're driving people apart. The centripetal forces that hold us together have weakened. The solution to that is how society works, right? It's just how we orientate towards society. It just goes through all of the ways that we interact with each other as human beings. And so you've got to think about, how does your education system work? You've got to think about, how does your healthcare system work? You've got to think about how you do aged care. You think about how our labour market works and how we interact in the workplace. We have to think about town planning. Like, they're all relevant elements of that because they're all the conditions under which we particularly connect with people different from us in a context where digital environments are sort of segmenting us and segregating us, and lots of other things are as well. So the point is, it's a little bit like the carbon footprint idea on climate change, I think, which is, the solution on climate is everything gets done a little differently over time. We shift, whether it's transportation or it's heating or it's any number of things, how we build houses and so forth. Similar to that, and it's a similar scale threat to our societies as well, the threat of social fracturing. I think that's the solution. It's to bring, and this is where, and some of my conversations with the ministry's officials have been super interesting for me, because I think Singapore's done that because of the unique conditions of the founding of the country. That's kind of been more integrated into thinking in all of those different areas. That is the role that government has, I think. Governments play a big role in everyone's lives in all countries around the world. They can do the stuff they do better, they have more effect, if they think through this lens of the cohesion of our societies. But it's not about just jawboning about it. Politicians, less than 1 in 5 people trust politicians in the Western world countries. Almost like the more they do that, the more you can politicize it. It just doesn't really help that much. Moving away from endless partisan conflict is certainly helpful, but it's actually much more, how do you drill this into all of the ways in which government functions?
I think government has an anointing function and a legitimizing function to an extent. The first one, anointing, meaning who does it listen to? Who does it promote and identify as somebody who influences its policy? And I can say that sometimes I've really disagreed with the people, certainly my government has listened to, and sometimes I've agreed. In order for it to anoint the right people, it needs to know about this area. It needs to be informed. It needs to be educated as to what is actually happening in the civil society space as regards faith. And the faith literacy or illiteracy amongst many governments, not here, but other places, is staggering. And, it's something that certainly in the UK context, government officials acknowledge that actually this is not something that we understand. And in terms of legitimizing, I mean not being not being so close to civil society activists, but actually maintaining a healthy distance so people can operate within their own respective functions. I think that so often government will deal with all sorts of other kind of stakeholders in society, but leave out faith, because it doesn't understand. And it's not because of a lack of willingness, it's just not there. And what I'm really interested in, particularly amongst newer NGOs and newer bodies, it's about, people are actually understanding that faith stakeholders are normal stakeholders like any other stakeholders. And indeed, my organization's mission, theory of change, is about normalizing intelligent faith in the public square. So, but I say intelligent faith, meaning faith that is that has a competence, that has an expertise, that has something to contribute, not just because you're of faith. So the more competent we are within the faith sector, the more we will be recognized. But the problem occurs when government authorities overlook that competence, because that's the cost borne by us all.
Can I just add one point to that? When I was in Australia in the Prime Minister's office, I worked for a Prime Minister who was conspicuously, openly a person of faith, and I think I was kind of probably the most conspicuous, if not one of the only people of faith within in the senior staff. So I had the job of outreach to faith leaders in Australia for briefly, and the surprising thing I had, so I did a bunch of outreach, but the surprising thing that I encountered was these guys are like really unprepared for this, in the sense that a lot of them then became just special interest advocates.
Yeah.
Give us the tax deduction, all of those things. It was all kind of all rats and mice stuff, rather than the bigger interests in society. That's why the work you're doing on faith and leadership is so important, because there's also, it runs two ways. You know, faith leaders, in order to be relevant to the big issues that a Prime Minister's office is dealing with, need to be conversant and need to have that ability to think about the interests of the whole of society as well.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that. I think Singapore being very famously legislative, right? There's a joke that goes around, Singapore is a very fine country, fine everything, and people will listen. I mentioned the Maintenance of Religious Harmony Act previously, and I think I can see where, I think globally as well as in Singapore, we see a shift towards these kinds of community initiatives, trying to understand the other. And even under that Maintenance of Religious Harmony Act, there was an amendment recently which included a community remedial initiative, which basically gives offenders, like people who basically offend communities, racially or religious communities, the opportunity to kind of get to know that community, right? So they provide these opportunities, and they're voluntary, but they also take into account the fact that you're willing to kind of learn. And I think they provide these avenues, show that there's a shift, right, from just merely punitive legislation to kind of understanding.
Oh gosh, I wish we had that. Gosh, that's so good. Can you imagine?
Yeah,
really important.
There was also one example, I think Singaporeans here would know, where an influencer inadvertently insulted a couple of young Sikh men, and the Sikh community actually reached out to her and said, come over, share in our culture, and find out more about us. And I think that was one of the things that inspired the state as well. Okay, with that, let's open up the floor to questions. First, the gentleman over there, the long, and then this lady here with the green. Next, thank you.
Hi, my name is Alvin. I'm an assistant professor at the Department of Political Science at National University of Singapore. I just have a two-finger question on the previous question on the role of government. So over the past few days, we have heard very powerful stories about how these platforms, narratives, and leaders can make a difference in reducing prejudice and in-group versus out-group attitudes. But we can see these platforms, narratives, and leaders as kind of micro efforts in the larger, broader context of a domestic country's context, right? And there are larger forces at play. And the larger forces at play are these politicians and the government, where they may be incentivized, actually, politically, to deepen divisions, to foster divisions, right? It may be politically beneficial for them to actually deepen divisions and foster divisions. So the question is, what if government is the source of the problem and not the solution? Are these micro efforts doing enough at all? Thank you.
Shall we take the next question first and then together?
Thank you. Good morning. I'm Zarmeen Hassan from Australia. I represent an organization called Salam Fest, and we are a Muslim arts festival that essentially uses arts, culture, and food to build bridges between the Muslim community and the wider Australian community. We navigate three components of identity. So obviously our Australian identity, our Muslim identity, and then people from cultural and linguistic diversity, our cultural identity. So I would be Muslim Australian with a Pakistani origin, right? These are the three identities we navigate. And where they converge or where they overlap is where Salam Fest works through, like I said, arts, culture, and food. Now, what I wanted to understand is, what are the components of identity that you are working with in the areas of work that you are doing? And also, how are you navigating the various components of identity so that they all come together under a single umbrella as a salad, bringing the uniqueness to the table, rather than the fear of assimilating and becoming a soup. Thank you.
It's a very good analogy. Would you like to start with the government question?
Yeah. I think a way to understand, so politicians are often, that's right, they can drive division, they can exploit fractures in communities. That's certainly the case with the sort of populist forces, the insurgent forces in a lot of countries that have been transforming politics in the last decade. The challenge is obviously that our information environment is creating incentives for that. There's a ton of research about this, but the way in which platforms work is they do elevate extremes. The business model is built on that. It exploits vulnerabilities in our psychology, and that makes it harder for political leaders as well, and the political leaders have those incentives. And then there are kind of structures within political systems, as in the United States with gerrymandering, redistricting, a bunch of quite specific things about how the political system now works, which actually have been a strength for the US in the past, but are now actually kind of accelerating these forces of division. How do you counter that? Well, my experience is that there's always, people who are conflict experts talk about the notion of in-group moderates, that is, moderates who are within a group identity, and they can kind of pull people back, they can enforce norms. It's very difficult for somebody outside of a group who doesn't belong to a group. So for example, if you take the Republican-Democrat division in the United States, a Democrat can't enforce behavior on Republicans, but a Republican might be able to. And so this notion of strengthening those forces, and this is an aspect of the work that More in Common does, because we do a lot of very detailed and pretty robust public opinion research. We work with political leaders within all of the parties, all the democratic parties, left, right, centre, to help them develop strategies that are cohesion strategies. Because I think you can be true to your conservative identity, you can be true to your liberal identity, you can be true to your progressive identity. You can have what I describe as a kind of common ground politics, or a more in common politics, and be true to your values. Commonality is not about all of us being the same. It's having difference and navigating difference. So there are people. I think there is a gap in often you've got a bunch of nice people who are making the argument for how do we overcome division, and then you've got the real hardheads who listen to all of that, and it's all a little bit kumbaya to them. It's like, oh, the reality is we've got to smash the other side, we've got to win. And I've been exposed to that in my life because I was working as a political advisor. I think that we need to find ways in that are strategic, thoughtful, that are realistic about how the political system works. And I would say, I think it's quite hard to do that in the United States because it's very advanced, its polarization. But we've certainly had very constructive relationships across the political spectrum in France, Germany, and the UK. Where it doesn't mean there are polarizers in political parties. Also within, I would say, kind of all of them, other than the extreme parties, there are people who are pretty responsible and wanting to build that common ground. And I think working with them is possible. And I think we need more initiatives and people who understand that game, because the political leadership is very important. It can't stop these forces of division, but it can certainly accelerate them. And in many countries, politics is a really powerful accelerant force. It's not the only solution. Like the media piece is very important. Faith, it's all of the leadership roles that enforce norms. But I absolutely agree that the political piece is quite central. And we've got to the people who have the professional background and experience, not everybody, right? But like the people who've got that background, we need them to be engaging thoughtfully and trying to find, to tell the story that we are navigating difficult times of change, but we can navigate them together. Division is not, and fracturing of our societies is not inevitable. We are bigger than our differences. And I think that's an argument that every generation has to hear again. And right now, it's a message that not enough people are hearing.
Okay, so if I can, Shane, with your permission, on Alvin's question, the person I would listen to is Lord Alderdice, John, who's at the front over here. So at some point, if the mic could go to him. But for what it's worth, in the UK context, I'm interested that there is such a phenomenon as dog whistle politics, and I'm interested that we have been called to work with by elements of the Conservative Party, the government, on its Islamophobia, or Islamophobia within its ranks, and with the Labour Party on perceived anti-Semitism and Hindu-phobia within its ranks. And what do? We bring people to the common ground and do exactly what you referred to, which is get people to understand the other. I think that there is something about why it is that politicians behave in this way. What is motivating them? Is it because they are part of a majority that is feeling threatened, or is it because they are a minority that is feeling threatened? I note the threat everywhere. As for Zahin's question about soup versus salad, yes, I mean, there's room for both. I think, what are the components of identity? I think whatever it is, it needs to be deep. That's the thing. So people, or the religious figures I know, or people who are religiously inclined, or even the people who are on websites and then are being taken astray, are finding some depth or something that is filling a void, and that then impels them to do things and impacts their behavior. And I think the more we have events that bring people together, and genuinely, it's not just, so what happens when you bring people together is that some people might be left out. And then those people who are left out might then say, well, this is not for me, I need to do this and that. But the more we have, the more those people who feel left out will find somewhere to belong, because we're all looking to belong. But yeah, absolutely, the more cultural sharing that takes place over food, the more hospitality that takes place, and the more we are ready to be hosted, which is what we encourage, everywhere. So it's not just our programs are like this, but people go into people's homes and see how others live, and that radical hospitality is fundamental. And if government can somehow bless that, or say this is a great thing, or legitimize that, that's it. It doesn't have to get into the reeds and the rushes, but in answer to the question. But if we know that that's a good thing to do, rather than saying, oh my goodness, no, that church, we don't need to do anything there. And if that's then aligned with deep discussions, sensitively held, then that's a really good thing. John, did you want to say anything? Do you mind, Shane? Sorry.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity and also for the contributions you've made. This is a very complex area of things, and I'd like to introduce just one or two elements which have been adverted to, but maybe probe a little bit. One is this question of politics and politicians. If you ask people what do they think about politicians or politics, they generally go, but who elects them? If you ask people, what about your MP or elected representative? They say, oh, well, he or she's completely different. I mean, they pay attention, they respond to my letters, and so on and so on. So there's something about the difference in dealing with people at the level of individuals and at the level of the large group. Another one of the differences between these two elements is it's much easier to have a thoughtful, rational conversation with a small number of people than it is to engage a crowd of 5,000 in a thoughtful, rational, exploratory conversation. It's almost always going to be something that's emotionally powerful and driving. And I don't say that in a way to kind of set emotions at a lower level, because emotions can be very powerfully positive, but the point is they're quite different from simply thinking rationally. And the third thing is, I'm hearing some kind of interesting conflict almost between the notion of commonality and common space and more in common, and a recognition of the importance of giving difference its place. And in a sense, I'm not sure how much it is that we have more in common, but we have some important things in common. And recognizing and trying to work with that degree of commonality that also recognizes and accepts the plurality of difference. That's one of the dilemmas that we've got. And I agree that Singapore has worked extraordinarily in that, but by dint of that has been heavily criticized by many liberal democratic workers and activists and parties and organizations globally. And I think that's one of the things that makes Singapore extremely interesting, because some of those who would have been identified most as liberal democratic activists are some of those that you will find most difficult to work with in incorporating people who have radically different perspectives. Platforming and cancelling actually came from people who would like to call themselves liberals, but have become intolerant liberals. And if that's a contradiction in terms, what do you expect from an Irishman?
Thank you. Any response before I go to the next question? Oh, the lady in red has disappeared. Can we get the gentleman in red first? Over there.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. My name is Martin Sinaga from Indonesia. I'm representing National Council of Churches of Indonesia. I heard, if I may say, the red thread from the first day of our meeting was Lily Kong has said that the issue of our cohesive unity will be on class line. The class line issue will be our very serious ongoing issue. And yesterday, Madam Shiva has mentioned, I quoted a little bit, she said that the coexistence of social mobility among economic classes, among economic injustice, if I may change the word, will be the way of our cohesive reality. So what I'm asking both of you is that, are we now a little bit artificial dealing with diversity if we are not addressing the ongoing, if I may say again in another word, free market capitalism as the whole reason why we are living in a more precarious situation nowadays? In one of our research, because I am also helping our government for the so-called religious moderation. I am a national instructor for religious moderation. Indeed, we learn about this diversity. We have in Indonesia a very strong root of Pancasila as a kind of unifying forces, but yet we seems to lose ways to be a just society. It seems that because of the post-communist era, 9/11, etc., we unable to find a strong means to have a more just global society. So then my second question, how could we, while understand that commonality, diversity is what matters now, we should not forget that justice, economic justice, is one of the very important roots for cohesive society. Thank you very much.
Take one more question from the gentleman in front. Thank you.
Thank you, Moderator. Lawrence Chong from the Vatican Dicastery for Interreligious Dialogue. Very appreciative of the comments. My question is, and this is coming from the 10 years of experience I worked in Religions for Peace, the financial war chest. How do you deal with the financial war chest of religious groups, even governments funding extremist views, versus the kind of the war chest that we try to raise to build interreligious dialogue? I think the struggle is we are always dealing with 1 to 10. 10 being there's much more money funding intolerance, extremism, exporting them. You know, even in this part of the world, we are dealing with that money flow, and love your opinion on that. On the second question I want to ask is that have you come across any matrix that talks about sources of funding and how those funding creates fissures in those societies that and creates and engenders intolerance? And if there's any of, because in another piece of work that I do for interreligious dialogue is we are very interested to understand the impact on money flows. Yeah, thank you.
I'll have it, yeah. So our friend from Indonesia, I think I would agree that it is hard to discuss issues like diversity and cohesion when people are in abject poverty, and that you become more vulnerable to being used or otherized, or given a group identity that can be then set against another group identity, because you say, well, they've got these resources and we haven't, and people can manipulate that. So to that extent, of course, there needs to be economic justice. I think that the extent to which government should specifically ensure that, faith communities should specifically ensure that marginalized groups have a share of the wealth, really is dependent on the context that we're living in, and that's the best I can say. So in the UK context, so often the faith communities have been pilloried for being a voice of conscience against initiatives and overtures that government has seen as, that the faith communities have seen as really hostile to conscience. And I think that that's what faith communities should stick to in the main. But when we talk about faith communities, you have the best scientists within faith communities, you have bankers within faith communities, you have the people who are creating this, playing a role in this class struggle, if you could put it that way, within faith communities. And I'm far more interested in finding out what resources there are, intellectual, spiritual, within faith communities, to ensure that we have a more egalitarian society. That's where my focus is, I guess.
And did you want to touch the financing?
In a second. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think on the piece about the role of capitalism and economic marginalization, in this sphere, there's often a debate between what's the most important driver of growing polarization and how much is that economic versus how much of it is culture and identity. And I confess that I probably, because I'm a trained economist and once was an economic advisor, that I might have a bias towards the former. But I actually think, from my research, I really think it's much more about identity. I think that economic precariousness or vulnerability has an effect of increasing people's insecurity, and insecurity is kind of, I see it somewhat more through the identity lens ultimately, that it's sort of the dehumanization that you get in kind of pure market societies, the anxiety associated with not knowing, you know, where your kids are going to get their food from tomorrow, and the loss of status or pride associated with work in an environment of automation, the gig economy, all of those things, the kind of insecurity of work, that they're ultimately the means by which they make people more vulnerable to division, to us versus them, to seeing another group as an enemy, is actually more through the lens of kind of culture and identity. So in that sense, I think culture is a bit of a catch-all. The contrast to that, though, is sort of part of the answer to that. I mean, we can't boil the ocean. I'm not going to dismantle capitalism. But the counter to that actually is that faith is a very powerful source of capacity to manage through hardship. And let me give you a really practical example of that. I mentioned the belonging barometer that this organization Over Zero are going to be releasing in the next few weeks. If I can give you a sneak peek into one of the findings, and it's all data in the US, they're an organization that works globally, but they've started in the US. Unsurprisingly, they've done like an index of belonging from 0 to 5, that each individual answers a bunch of questions and they can kind of rank them. And unsurprisingly, socioeconomic status is very closely allied to people's sense of belonging. However, there are some people with very low socioeconomic status but a high sense of belonging. Guess who those people are? Members of faith communities is one of the principal reasons why. In other words, people's capacity to feel belonging, to feel security in their identity, in their place, you know, it's more than just money. So I think that, you know, look, it's an interaction between those two things, but I do think it's often how the economic factors then drive people's sense of identity and security that are most important. And I have to say, I'm not on the second issue of financing. I confess that I am beyond my expertise at that point.
Yeah, me too, but I'm interested that, you know, you're looking at that, Lawrence, that you're interested in the war chest and the fact that you're connected to the Vatican. That's what I heard. So that's fascinating to me. I mean, you know, the role of faith is to keep people honest and loving, really. I mean, everything else is superfluous. And it's, you know, we just need to put our resources there. And when it goes elsewhere, there's an agenda. That's all I can say.
Take questions from this side of the... Oh, yes, over there? Sure. And then later on this side.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I have a follow-up question following the comments from the presenter and the gentleman from Vatican. As we notice that many rich countries, developed countries, fund massively some group, religious group, to go to developing country, least developed country, and conduct massive proselytism by conversing massively. They aim mainly at the vulnerable group, the tribe, the minority ethnic group. By doing so, they are causing a lot of harms to the cohesiveness and the social unity among the least developed country. And I am talking here not only about the religion, any religion, but in my country, they are also aiming at the enemies, because we consider that even if you don't have any religion, you are protected by the Constitution. So my question here to the meeting is, and to especially to the presenter, is how to handle and to face with this proselytism which harm our cohesiveness. Thank you.
Take one more question at the back.
Magandang umaga po. Good morning. I'm Jay Castañeda from Philippines. And I work in the government, under the government in the Philippines, and especially in the LGBTQ community. I'm really benefiting from this interfaith engagement and exchanges since day one. And everyone here is treated fairly, regardless of race, gender, age, ethnic background, social orientation, or other differences. So my question is, how does social context influence our perceptions of race, class, and gender, or sexual identity? Thank you.
Okay, can I start? So the point on conversion, I think, is well taken. I think, sorry? Talk loud, okay. The point on conversion is well taken. From Laos, okay, from Laos. I think that it's really interesting because not only some people, some groups that like to convert are very well funded, talking about the flow of money in the war chest. And the reports they write about, that I've seen anyway, the reports that I won't mention any organizations, but they kind of say, have you seen the abject poverty and the plight of these people living in this area? And then they say, and then the atrocities against people of our faith, without any real factuals. And then a bunch of funders in the United Kingdom or Los Angeles who have nothing to do with what the on-the-ground situation will then fund more conversion-type activities. Now, I'll say for the record that we have to handle this very sensitively, because obviously when in my work, just talking about me, when I work very closely with my brothers and sisters from the other faith communities, some of them will try and convert me. But because that conversion occurs in a context of love, I'm sorry to come back to these strange concepts like love, but but I see it, okay, he is or she is trying to share with me the highest thing that they have. It's a gift that this person wants to give to me, and I see it in that era. When it becomes a strategy to go into a situation and usurp an actual culture and destabilize things. I mean, it's not a strategy to do that, but the consequences are a massive destabilization of a situation. And it's, people from Swamiji will be familiar with this, in India, other places. This is not a good thing. And so I'm not against conversion. I'm not against even proselytization. But I am against it being part of an unthinking strategy to get more people on our side, because fundamentally the people that we are, evangelizing to are evil, or some variant of that, or need our help. But it's a complex situation. Ultimately, everyone's rights to practice their faith and their beliefs should be protected, and that's another role for government. And I speak as somebody who's on the UK Freedom of Religion and Belief Forum. Yeah.
I think one dimension that actually links those two questions together, on proselytizing and on LGBT community, that navigating change and pluralism is difficult in all societies, and it always has been. One of the things that is making that a lot more difficult is partly because of the information environment that we were talking about yesterday in the plenary session. People are more exposed to the extremes, more likely to view the extreme conduct of a small number of people within a group as typical of that whole group, which goes to the perception gap issue that I mentioned applies in many different contexts. But people are more willing to believe more extreme things about other people. And I think that the muscle that we need to develop to navigate the challenges of pluralism and to navigate change, I think that muscle's grown flaccid for many of us. And I think it's why the leadership work is so critical, because there is a very distinctive challenge of leadership within pluralist societies, and all of our societies are becoming, through globalism, and becoming more pluralist. There's a ton of things that we can learn from the past. Northern Ireland is one place that we can look to for insight. But part of what we need is actually a sense of confidence about our ability to navigate change. Now, at a very practical level, because we constantly do research and do focus group conversations with people, I've been exploring this in the last couple of years. When people get stuck, like the issue of trans rights is actually an issue in which some countries, culture wars, people are getting stuck right now. And one way into that conversation that we've found quite constructive is saying to people, tell us about your parents and their views. Tell us about their views of gay people, or tell us about their views of the role of women. And almost invariably, at least in Western societies, people will start saying, oh, my parents, they're pretty backwards, or they were, I had to deal with a lot of prejudice from them. But then they're kind of very nervous about the next wave of social change. But then at least saying to them, but when we had those debates about the role of women in Western societies, particularly 60s, 70s, it felt like the world was going to cave in. There was very extreme language from the forces that opposed to sort of equality, gender equality. And of course, I know that continues today, but it was particularly a prominent debates in those days. And we made it through. And we test this. We ask, do you feel proud of the changes that we've made? And 80% of people, Western societies, say absolutely proud. Actually, it's fascinating how quickly the numbers, not quite as high in LGBT recognition, but they're very quickly rising. So building from that sense of confidence, or just building a sense of confidence, we can navigate change. We have navigated it in the past. These things can be difficult. I know maybe I struggle with this, but then my parents struggled with other things that I've accepted. And just developing ways in which we can have conversations that kind of draw out from the deep conflict and the stuff that we wrestle with most hard, and actually sort of see this within the larger context of how we manage pluralism. I think that's the muscle that we need to develop, and we need to be able to apply that not just at the very generic level, but actually have conversations about the issues that are divisive and difficult to manage on these issues, but within that larger, but sort of bring them to a larger context as well.
We get 2 more questions. One question from this gentleman in the vest, please. And one more from the lady at the back in the pink. The gentleman behind you.
Thank you. I'm Saul from Buddha Life Association, a Buddhist organization in Singapore. My question is for faith in leaderships. I think it must be a very delicate matter to bring together leadership from different faiths into one room and have discussion and interaction. So can you share with us what's the key ingredients for the program to be a success, and what are some of the pitfalls that should be looked out for? Thank you.
So can we squeeze in this lady in black, please? And then you.
Hi, a peaceful morning. Assalamu alaikum. I'm Rohaniza Sumdad Usman from Teach Peace, Build Peace Movement, and I'm from the Philippines. My question is, first, in terms of context, when it comes to public policies, we all know that there will always be 2 things to be mindful of, especially when it comes to protecting our children and youth from violent extremism. One is making sure that the policies are inclusive or non-discriminatory. Second is making sure that the policies are communicated at a grassroots level and are properly implemented. So how can we assure that these two important components will be included or observed? And can you also share with us effective monitoring mechanisms when it comes to policies? Thank you so much. Shukran jazilan.
Last question.
Hello, good morning, everyone. My name is Farain Jaffa. I'm an anti-bias, anti-racist educator from Singapore, and I'm also a volunteer with HashPeace, a youth-led organization that promotes social cohesion. My question today is, before I start, research has shown that education plays an important role in promoting social cohesion and dismantling bias and prejudice. Could the speakers share the steps your countries have taken to tap on this important resource of promoting social cohesion through education, if any? If there aren't, what can be improved and implemented through public policy? Thank you.
Thank you. So should I answer the faith and leadership one? So thank you for that question, sir. I think the main thing, you're right, it's a very sensitive thing. It doesn't just happen. The first thing is to create a space of trust within which people have confidence, and a container, if you like. And the container that we have is formed by a fantastic faculty of faith leaders, activists, and practitioners who have the confidence of the community. And now, the challenge is ensuring actually that faculty is cohesive and stay on board. As the faculty members here will let you know, that there are some dotted around this conference. I won't mention any names. But that's the main challenge. If they're on board, then we can really face anything. And on our program, we have had, while atrocities have been occurring around the world, we have been able to protect our safe environment so that people are then fortified to confront the challenges in the outside world. So yeah, I think that to recognize that it's not you're saying, right, I have the answers and I'm training you. I'm not. We have to have the buy-in of some of the best people, the best servant leaders in society. So thanks for a gift question. And can I just say that I am a fan of HashPeace. That's all I want to say. So there you go.
On that, the question of education, I think that the piece to be conscious of is, in some cultural contexts, your capacity to do top-down solutions is more limited. In other contexts, there's more capacity, and I would emphasise that, because some of the conversation has been, the myth-busting, the education piece. I 100% believe in that, but ultimately, I don't know. The evidence to me is that if you have a weak sense of belonging, if you're very fearful of other groups, then some of that education can be, people can actually kick back in response. They can react negatively to it. If somebody's waving a finger at them and telling them how to be, a better person, I am really struck by our research across Western countries, how deeply people with less education resent highly educated people. It's the biggest fracture, actually, in a lot of countries, increasingly. And the highly educated, more educated, are so blind to it, so ignorant of it, because, you don't kind of get it. You see somebody else's problem as ignorance. So that itself becomes a form of elitism. And I think that this is the value of thinking in terms of belonging. How do we strengthen people's sense of belonging, their sense of place, their sense of being respected? How do we uplift everyone? And how do we turn down the anxiety and the fear of others? And just one thing to say on the other question on communication strategies and measuring impact. The thing is, I was a judge for a narrative change contest recently as one of the judges, and I was evaluating 90 proposals to achieve narrative change around economic mobility narratives. So basically getting away from the idea that the poor are a sort of a marginalised, vulnerable, like victimised group, and talking about the agency of the poor and shifting people's perceptions of poverty being the fault of poor people, basically. So I read 90 proposals. Only 2 of them made any mention of the audience that they were reaching. And I think there is a fundamental problem in communication. Communication is so often centred in people's own place that they're coming from, and people often have so little curiosity about the people that they're trying to reach. So if I had one piece of advice about effective communication strategies around inclusion, it's more curiosity about the people you're talking to and getting into the granular detail, because there's not enough of that, you know. And if you're just only thinking about your values and how do I communicate what my message is, it might just land terribly because you haven't taken an interest in who you're trying to reach.
We have come to the end of our session. I'd like you to invite all of you to give a round of applause to our speakers and thank them.